Well, let me first of all tell you what we're not here to do. We're not here to get bogged down in the definition of sustainability or get too off track on some amorphous things that don't mean something to your business or your customers' businesses sometime over the next number of years. There are ways you can learn about those things. There are other resources. I would encourage you to go do that. Instead, what we have here is an opportunity to have folks who are serious experts within their various spaces. If you think of the sustainability conversation in the U.S. over the last 5, 6, 7 years, frankly, maybe going back a decade, there's no singular voice that would be more often recognized as an expert in that space than Dr. Sara Place. That's not an exaggeration. She's humble. She'll pretend that might not be the case, but almost everybody in here knows that's just spot on accurate. You met Mr. Steve Wooten. Again, as you probably already gathered, that's one articulate Colorado cowboy. That's who you want helping us on the front line of these conversations. Dr. Scott Howard is next to him. PhD in meat science from Colorado State. Wisconsin boy by birth and pedigree. Angus background, still involved in a beef business. Classically trained meat scientist, but deeply versed in the packing business. A unique role that he had for many years at Cargill Beef, and now is one of the executive team at Meyer Natural Foods, based just up the road. Dr. John Crowley over on the end, when we allow him to use his mic, you will be the most entertained. You'll know why in a second. And so at that point, this hillbilly's voice will grate you immensely, even more than it does now. Dr. Crowley is our geneticist on the panel. Irish man by birth, if I recall, has spent a variety of time in various segments within the European business and a great deal of time in the Canadian beef business, and is often seen on the American circuit because he's young, he's inventive, and he's darn capable. So that's our audience. So you hear a lot of folks talk about, well, beef, let's just make it better. Right? What you hear from the round table is, we are really good at our craft. We make a sustainable product. Oh, by the way, we might be able to get better. And I appreciate that perspective, and you as an executive there helped with that a great deal. And Dr. Vanderlei, I think, said that our cows provide an ecosystem service. I really like that. Some might say that's an upcycler. Call it what you will. Steve, we're going to start really real because most of these folks are seed stock producers, and you acknowledged that earlier. So I want to start by some of the affirmation and maybe some pain points. As you're sourcing sires, what are some of the things that you think relative to operational sustainability? What are some of the things you think we as a seed stock business do pretty well right now? What are some of the holes that we got to up our game?
Wow, good question. We're going to jump into the deep end right at the very beginning, where the seed stock industry is really embracing trying to help us get better in our operation, to have more efficient cattle, to meet the goals that our business needs, but also because we sell calves at 205 to 220 days old, those steers go on to somebody else. And we need those steers to match what we're claiming they can do. And bringing technology into the business with us is essential so that we can make that claim. And I give the seed stock guys credit. What we do when we visit a farm, we want to meet the family. We want to take a look at the operation. And finally we get to the decision of purchasing bulls because we've evaluated the background of the people that we're going to deal with. And does it match our philosophies of how we want to raise a cattle, how we need a cow to function in a very tough environment and be a productive type cow. You asked me about holes in the business, and I'll pick on the one that I'm most familiar with. We have been complaining for over a decade about birth weight creep in Red Angus. When we started buying bulls for the family in 1990, you didn't see a 100-pound Red Angus calf. It's a foundational philosophy of Sally and Waldo Forbes and George Chiga and the others that formed that association. They said live calves create profitability. And now we see 20% of the bulls at a bull sale that have 90 to 100-pound birth weight. And that's just one in our association that I felt like was, we're letting some things go. In others, I would say it's cow weight. We're seeing cows get pretty big. And in some environments, the further north you go, you have to have a bigger cow for capacity. In our environment, you get much over 1,200 pounds at October, the day you're weaning, and you're probably going to exceed the environmental capability of keeping that cow in condition. She's going to suffer and need supplements. So those two would be the two aspects that I see where I would advocate for watching that close.
Dr. Howard, explain to us, if you would, from both a business model standpoint and frankly an efficiency and a sustainability play, why might a packing organization continue to increase their demand and interest in not only rich meated cattle, high marbling cattle, but also bigger carcasses?
Yeah, it's a great question, and actually it's kind of ironic that we hit on one of the topics that we just did a second ago in the sense of talking live calves generating revenue and maybe extrapolating that to pounds weaned per cow exposed, whatever that may be, right? It's the amount of weight that you can sell as a producer based on the resources that are going into that particular operation, whether it's the fixed costs of land, whatever it may be. Spinning that around on the packing side, there is an astronomically high number of fixed expenses in the form of labor, energy, other resources that have to be offset, right? And in particular, when margins start to suffer, as they are now in the packing industry, the best way to do that is dilution is the solution, right? We're going to run a 900-pound carcass just as quickly as we're going to run a 700-pound carcass, and we're going to do it with just as many resources in terms of labor, energy, all those things that we talk about on the sustainability front. But if we're running that 900-pound carcass versus an 800-pound carcass, depending on the math, you might be saving upwards of a penny a pound in terms of your spend on those resources in those 900-pound carcasses. So it really just is a dilution of your fixed expense and the pounds per man hour that we're producing at the packing level, which I would draw some equivalency to in the ranching segment of pounds weaned per cow exposed. So it's definitely a little bit of a catch-22, but I think there are some solutions to it on both ends of the spectrum.
So I'd be remiss before I left you then, because you're also a cattleman and you come from that background and family still does that. So how do you balance that with the cows that you have at home?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think maybe the idea that a bull might be quote unquote a terminal sire or a specialist in one area has almost gotten somewhat derogatory in the cattle breeding business. There's a lot of bulls out there, there's a lot of breeds out there that are trying to be, in my mind, everything to everybody, and as a result, the notion that we can have a 1,200-pound cow that's mated with a terminal sire producing an animal that might finish at a heavier end weight and keeping that cow more moderate on the front end is something that I think we can really explore and really, again, allow some of those bulls or those genetics to specialize in certain areas, be it within a breed or more specifically using heterosis as a tool to take advantage of that through the process.
So from a geneticist standpoint, are there tools that we can help put at their disposal, or more importantly, their customers' disposal, to help them navigate that conundrum that Dr. Howard just mentioned? Our customer is clear, and clarity can be kind, right? That they want them big and they want them to marble. But we got to do this cow thing as well. From a geneticist standpoint, how does that smack you? And are there ways we can navigate this a little bit?
I think generally there's tools that you can get going with right now, and there's also tools that we can develop, right? So if we want to get going on that right now, I think that problem's been there even without sustainability being in question. Like how do you have your cow that you want like no massive maintenance of, but yet get your big slaughtered animal out of? So that's been there without even sustainability being an issue. So I think as an industry we've done good jobs on looking at the maternal cow base and also being able to push that end weight. The only thing is that as you maybe go for bigger and bigger carcasses, what seems to be happening is that age at slaughter seems to drift every year by a little bit. And that's maybe where the sustainability thing would have a bit of a red flag, is the more days you have those animals on feed. It's not just a cost, it's also a carbon cost as well. So I think that's one where we need to concentrate and maybe look at a new tool, is how do we rein in those ages at harvest or ages at slaughter. You don't want to be maintaining those slaughtered animals for too long. It's a dilution of maintenance thing. If you can get those gains done as quick as possible, but then also maybe you have to be cognizant of what we were talking earlier this morning. Those fast gaining animals maybe have a problem with heart scores. So it's all tied in together. So I think we have the tools at the moment of how we have a good maternal base. And I think the selection tools are there for that. I think it's on the other end, is how do we push those gains to get quicker and better and to end up with the end product for the packer. And that end product for a packer, there's something in that as well, just as I have the mic. We're in the commodity beef and the luxury side of it are a little different sometimes, but the fact that there is a certain amount of fat needed on the product, but the cost, whether it's an economic cost, feed cost, energy cost, carbon cost of putting that fat on a carcass is quite a bit above putting that lean on an animal. So I don't know, maybe there's a question in there. Maybe I'm acting as a moderator now, but maybe there's a question in there as well, is where does that fat and lean, like a lean carcass going out the door real quick is probably the best economical and carbon cost product to get out the door. And you can tackle that from increasing the genetic merit to allow that to happen. But I'm not sure the packer wants all lean beef coming through the door either.
I suspicion that's probably correct, at least right now. So, Dr. Place, from your experience, are there opportunities, or maybe there's research in place to help us, maybe more importantly, our cattle feeders like Billy, who was speaking earlier, to better utilize resources there at the latter stages of the feeding period so that they can meet the demands of maybe some of the customers that Scott's dealing with from a pull-through standpoint? But still, we don't want to take away from the marbling ability of those.
Yeah, so that's always the challenge with beef, right, is we're trying to balance all those things at once, and especially the forage-based part of the industry versus the feeding side, right? I think it's always important to take a step back and recognize if we only looked at, say, enteric methane, which is the biggest chunk of that carbon cost, if you will, or the carbon emissions from beef. That's the beauty of feedlots, right, is they're basically putting on half the carcass weight gain, but they only put on 20% of the emissions on the total footprint, right? So sometimes it's counterintuitive, but increased days on feed and an increased proportion in the feed yard will lower the carbon footprint of beef, just because you are diluting, back to that denominator, the total maintenance cost of the cow herd, the heifers, the bulls that are behind each individual animal. That's not to say there's not a break point if there's other things that are important for you to consider, right? And I think that question of where's the optimum endpoint of beef of an animal is always something that's on the mind of cattle feeders in the industry, and that obviously changes with economic conditions. But I think it's more thinking about all the tools in our toolbox, right? Now we have obviously the opportunity with genetics. We also have the opportunity with more precision technologies, right? And thinking about, well, how do we sort groups of cattle to get them more uniform to hit, right? That ideal of not too much external fat, still a high quality product. And I think as we have more technology in that space, whether it's using artificial intelligence, using cameras, using other technology to know and dial in when that optimum endpoint is and where you hit that point of basically falling off the map with feed conversion efficiency and you're not, right? It's not advantageous for you to hang on to those animals any longer. I think that's a huge opportunity. There's innovation in that space already, but that's a place where balancing those economics, the environmental piece, all of it together makes a whole lot of sense because all the points that have been raised, right? Ultimately, a carbon footprint isn't all of sustainability, but it's a nice way to roll everything that we know is important in the industry together, which is basically all your input costs, right? All your costs of doing business per unit of production, right? So it's a socially acceptable way to talk about efficiency, basically.
So you highlighted one of the things that tends to be a bit of an ouchie point for those at the ranch and farm level when it's pointed out that most of this burden actually falls at that level, right? Whether it's working on sustainability of the enterprise or various profitability incentives on your particular outfit as you drive, carbon in some ways can become a bit of a proxy measure for some of those things. And so it probably gets a little uncomfortable when they hear you say, a lot of this is their problem. Any comments on that?
So yeah, and that's the tricky part of this, and I know this is always the challenge, right? When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions is there's always the what about the grazing lands, what about carbon sequestration, which is an excellent point, and sometimes the answer is just, we don't know, and or we're at a situation where we don't have capacity to increase soil carbon sequestration much more, right? And I think there's lots of examples of like everything that Steve's done on their ranch for the last several decades of what you can do from a land management improvement that's much bigger than just carbon, which is very important to focus on. So it's not to ding the forage-based part of the industry, because ultimately that's a strength of the industry from a standpoint of we're creating food from low value inputs, right, from a human nutrition standpoint. But it is true also, if we think about the total footprint of beef, over half of all the greenhouse gas emissions from beef cattle production are actually methane that cattle naturally produce. And because there's more animals in that side of the industry, and because a higher forage diet means more methane, there is more of that burden on the grazing portion of the industry. So we see that with research that we have going on now at Colorado State. What's kind of unique is that we can look at animals over their life, over the life cycle. And some of, Dr. Enns has left, but we're hijacking all his cattle from the Rouse Ranch and measuring methane emissions on them. And when they're in a forage-based diet, a backgrounding diet, versus now when they're on a finishing diet, their methane emissions per unit of feed intake get cut in half when they go to the feed yard and they eat a grain-based diet, right? So again, it's just that energetic efficiency of that ration, right? There's those trade-offs that are inherent, but that is the reality with methane is more fiber, more forage, more methane that you're gonna get from the animals.
So, Mr. Wooten, she referenced you, so I'm going to come back to you. Are there some other steps that these folks can implement or encourage implementation at different levels that you all have also tried at your place that would align with both sustainability initiatives, but at the same time, just overall enterprise profit and sustainability from that standpoint?
Yeah, Chip, and I think what you're referencing is the key performance indicators that we've set a set of standards working with Colorado State University. Dr. Rhodes came from King Ranch Institute, and working with them in the track program at Colorado State University, we designed numbers based on what the averages were, and then we said we want to do better than that. So we expect 97+% of the cows to be pregnant in the fall. 99% of those cows better bring a calf to branding. And then the one that drives me crazy is why we don't have 100% of the calves make it to the market in October. That we've done everything we can do, but I understand we're dealing with lots of factors, but that's the kind of level we want to try to hit with that, and that's an efficiency factor. That there aren't animals out there that are grazing poor quality forages and not returning back to society a measurable amount of protein. And I can do that offset. I can function with that offset, realizing that yes, I'm responsible for X amount of methane and nitrous oxide in the way of urine put down on the ground, I can give society something back. And at the same time, the way that we've designed our grazing management, it has a wildlife component in it. It has a drought mitigation plan in it, so that at any given time, we've got measurable amount of carbon sequestration for a 9 to 14-inch rainfall area, a semi-arid environment. I think we're maintaining pretty much what that element can do. And to the point that Brady and Aaron are talking about, we've never done any carbon testing. We haven't ever felt like it's something, but thinking ahead and how society begins to ask you questions, they're thinking that maybe they need to develop that baseline and track what we think. And it's that same old saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. So we don't know if we're measuring the amount of carbon sequestration is proper for a low rainfall, short grass prairie ecosystem. And I'm proud of them for thinking that this is something we need to get on top of so that we can defend ourselves if we ever have to.
You mentioned earlier in your talk about the various targets and metrics within the roundtable. And one of those areas you discussed was the efficiency and yield area. And you touched on this. I'm going to pull on a little closer because you didn't talk a lot about the phrase genetics per se. But as you clearly know, and we've talked, that's where the genetics starts to invade in the most aggressive place relative to the roundtable initiatives. Would you agree on that?
Yep.
And so, as a result of that, Dr. Crowley, are there particular measures of efficiency relative to, again, either more mainstream metrics of efficiency or maybe the way they directly impact some of the carbon conversations? Are there metrics of efficiency / yield or cow longevity that either need to be developed or maybe they're tools that already exist that need to be utilized better?
So I think the end unit of your end goal is quite important when you address that question. So are you trying to chase a gross reduction? Let's say greenhouse gases as part of the sustainability thing. Are you trying to reduce the gross amount of greenhouse gases, or are you trying to improve the emissions intensity? Which, if you improve the ratio of emissions to product, you can still have emissions increase, but just product increases better, right? Or quicker. So I think so. What we've been doing anyway over the last number of decades, we've inadvertently been increasing or improving emissions intensity, I would say, just by chasing economical efficiency, right? They're very closely tied together. If you're reducing gross emissions from a system, a national herd, you have to do it a little differently. So if we're thinking about, and I would say, because if you don't want to reduce the amount of beef produced in the US, I don't think. So we're going to chase emissions intensity. I would think that's a sensible one. So I'll talk to that one. There, you're trying to increase the amount of output without necessarily increasing the amount of inputs, but that will get dragged along a little bit. So you're going to chase your aged slaughter. You're going to want less replacement heifers per cow there. So your replacement rate is one of those. Cow longevity, very important. You don't want to have to replace her after 3 years. You want to get as much out of her, because that heifer cost to get to age at first calving is going to be diluted across her whole lifetime. So all these traits are quite familiar to us. We weight in a selection objective at the moment, we weight them based on economic importance. And that's where our company have done a lot in the last 10 years, interacting with different companies and governments and breed associations around the world, beef, dairy, sheep, pigs, is how do you pull a few different levers away from the economic drivers and have a bit more cognizance of a sustainability metric on those. So, for example, calving ease or calving interval in dairy might have a certain economic weighting, but if you think of it from a carbon point of view and you put a cost to carbon, then actually it increases the importance of that. So all of a sudden in your relative emphasis inside the selection objective, some traits come out to be more important when sustainability is introduced to the equation over and above just breeding for economic profitability. So the tools are there. It's just how we need to push and pull a few different ones, and that takes just a bit of analysis. Look at a life cycle assessment of your US system. regress the traits we have currently in our breeding objective on that LCA and see what traits actually do affect an LCA, and you can get carbon weightings and put those inside into your selection indexes, either together or separately.
So I've got to control myself here because you got me on two tracks, because you mentioned a couple things that I'll pause on one, so we'll just pull on the other for a second. In our state of the industry conversation, it was discussed briefly how a couple European approaches to trying to get a handle on this might seem pretty heavy-handed by American standards. Do you see, would you be comfortable predicting, first of all, are those approaches even remotely a concern in North America? Two, from maybe more of a political standpoint, but maybe even more importantly, what are the impacts that you see on the European market? And as we're competing with them globally, we need to understand on emissions, carbon itself, based on those, what some might call a bit draconian approaches in a couple other countries.
I don't think we need to be wary of those approaches in the US. There's kind of a dichotomy of decisions in Europe and maybe to New Zealand as well. Some of them have chosen to reduce gross emissions, and those changes are a bit more drastic. And you know, if you think of a pie and you think what genetics can do to reduce emissions, if it's an emissions intensity, that chunk of the pie that genetics can attend to is a lot bigger. If it's gross, then it shrinks a little bit. Now there are actually managerial things that come into play a lot more, even policy things that come into a lot more, not letting the size of the national herd grow. You know, there's some policy things that people would shake their head at. But you know, I heard New Zealand mentioned earlier on, or my headquarters is in New Zealand, so we're very well aware of what's going on there. And as well as that, they've got a big impact on nitrates, water quality. Like ag has a big impact on their environmental metrics. But you know, in the US earlier on, 10% of greenhouse gases come from ag. In New Zealand, is it 60 or 70% of the country's greenhouse gases come from ag? So you know, when we're talking about, you know, oil and gas producers, chemical producers, everybody has a part to play in this. The New Zealand government is like ag, come on, you need to do lots of stuff here. So that's where, and then everybody puts this time horizon on doing this as well. Like, do it by 2050. Why 2050? Because it's got a zero at the end and it sounds nice and a title. So, you know, it's, oh, now we got to get our ducks in a row by 2050 and cut animal numbers, reduce stocking rates, genetics. Okay, and you've asked this in your question. I've rambled. I'll come back to the question. Something that you can do inside there that attends to both emissions intensity and gross emissions. One would be feed efficiency. So get more product out without putting more dry matter in. And also, there is variation around the biological methanogenesis of that dry matter being ruminated. So you would see, say, stuff that I'd be familiar with in Ireland, where I'm from, would be 20 grams of methane coming from a kilo of dry matter. But there is about 20% coefficient of variation around that between animals. They've seen this from lots of testing they've done with green feed. So that all of a sudden, you know, if you can save 1 gram, 2 grams of every kilo dry matter intake, multiply that up over all the dry matter intake that's on a farm per day, per year, per animal, per national herd. Now you're getting to big savings without doing anything to any other part of your system. And that helps with gross emissions. So some of the tools are there, you just have to weight them correctly. And they're some of the new tools, and I'd say that's something that you're looking at there with measuring methane and ROUS. Yeah.
And that's exactly where we're going to go. So, Dr. Place, first, go ahead and pull on that thread. And then that second piece that he got me thinking about, I'm going to come back to you on that one in a second, too.
Yeah, so we are doing that exact research at Colorado State. So we are measuring, you know, that was said earlier, phenotype is king, and that's where it's like with enteric methane in the United States, we're just way behind in terms of collecting those phenotypes. So we're trying to do everything that we can in terms of collecting as much data as possible on animals, obviously ones that are owned by CSU, but other research that we're doing as well. We see similar levels of variation, pretty substantial, even within those CSU-owned animals, 30+% variation, animals that are basically the same exact body weight, same average daily gain, yet they emit 30% different methane emissions, right? So based on that research in Ireland, in New Zealand, even with small ruminants, we know there is a heritable component of that. And so that's one of those exciting pieces of it is, yes, if you can genetically select for lower methane emitting animals, then you create a permanent reduction within the herd. And that's very important to what Dr. Crowley was talking about. This dichotomy of emissions per unit of production, emissions intensity, or carbon footprint, versus absolute or gross emissions is really, really important. And the verbiage around different greenhouse gas goals just highlights how important it is to find solutions to reduce emissions per head, to reduce emissions per animal, not just emissions per unit of beef. That's always important. Emissions intensity reductions are always important, but basically we're trying to decouple emissions growth from production. And we have done that in the United States, but we just need to do it more. And in a big picture, the reality is like we still have more human beings that are going to be on planet Earth, right? The rate of population growth is slowing, but we still need to feed everyone. And so this is always that dichotomy of we need to reduce total emissions, but also we can't shoot ourselves in the foot by not producing as much food, right? That's not actually an answer. And that's part of the difference between agriculture and some of these other industries that sometimes gets lost, right? It's like we have to produce food. It's not an optional activity. And while there's lots of debate about, well, you don't have to produce that much beef, right? As Steve shared, right, the quality of the nutrition and stuff is quite clear as well, that we need a certain threshold of meat, milk, eggs, and fish in our diets as human beings, most likely to have quality of life. So again, with sustainability, everything's always trying to balance all these things and trying to find solutions where we reduce emissions per animal opens up more possibilities for us to grow as an industry, still do these things, and still meet emissions targets in gross terms.
So you just said a word that almost every producer, if I ask a producer, what are you looking for in a cow? Somewhere in that conversation, almost guaranteed somebody's going to say, yada, yada, yada. I just want balance, right? And I appreciate the rational answer there is that, hey, there are a lot of things going on, but we have to kind of think about how these things impact each other. How well aligned does something as simple as feed conversion or maybe dry matter intake align within that variation, or are they just completely separate traits?
No, so I mean, if you look at it, I'm not a geneticist, right? But so if you look at it phenotypically, it highlights that you need to have a little bit more sophistication when you select for methane, because enteric methane emissions are strongly positively correlated to average daily gain, body size, dry matter intake, and actually slightly negatively associated with feed efficiency, right? So all those things would point to, you don't want to just select for low methane emitting animals, just like you would want to select for low growth, et cetera, right? So you have to be a little bit more sophisticated and pull those things apart, right? And think about animals that emit less than expected, given their body size, given their growth, et cetera, right? So I know there's differing opinions on things like residual feed intake, right? Or just putting it in an index and making sure we weight things correctly. But it's the same concept with methane, because at least again, from a phenotypic standpoint, it's strongly positively correlated with all of our production positive traits that we would care about.
And again, this goes a little bit back to what John had mentioned, and traits. You mentioned one perfect. Some of the efficiency measures that are often spoke about in our business, well, they're lovely, but I'm guessing Billy Schmitz would say, ultimately, to make money in my business, cattle got to eat. They need to eat a lot and have a good old appetite, and they need to gain. So sometimes we can have cute little efficiency measures that actually make us go broke. And so I appreciate where you're going there. I'm going to go back real quick to that second item that Dr. Crowley sparked, because if memory serves, you're a dairy lady from way back. And so John had mentioned the dairy business very briefly a moment ago, and it was also mentioned this morning in different portions of the conversation, the beef on dairy spot. Could you help us rationalize, first help us understand why the industry and the business views a dairy-produced beef calf a little differently from a carbon impact standpoint? Could you help us understand that and then maybe rationalize it for us a little bit?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on there from like a big systems perspective, right? So of course the dairy industry has always played an important role in the U.S. beef industry, with over 20% of the beef probably coming from dairy in some way, shape, or form. So really the difference now today with beef semen being used on dairies is really the differential between regular Holstein steers and dairy beef steers, if you will, right? We're not necessarily creating too many more pregnancies from dairy cows that are resulting in beef animals, maybe a little bit, but not too much more. Hopefully that makes sense. But in the grand scheme of things, this whole conversation we had earlier about thinking about the cow side, the maintenance costs, from a life cycle assessment perspective, when you look at beef that comes from the dairy herd, the cow and the impact of the cow is basically allocated to milk, right? So the animal comes in with a lower burden from the mama cow, if that makes sense, because that burden gets split across two industries and two different food products. So that's actually one of the reasons why, if you look at the European beef carbon footprint from a lot of different global analyses, Europe has a pretty low beef carbon footprint, and that's because such a high proportion of their beef is coming from dairy animals, right? With that said, I think it's very also important to put the brakes on. Sometimes people are like, well, if we just do all this dairy beef, then that lowers our carbon footprint, because again, the reality is that there's still roughly 9.3, 9.4 million dairy cows. We're not creating any more animals, right? We're just creating a different animal. And so the real benefit is the difference between how a Holstein steer performs and how these new crossbred animals perform, right? And sometimes there's positives, and then there's a whole host of other challenges, right, that we have on how we manage those animals through the system and calf ranches and everything else. But I think that's important, is that within that system in the U.S., we're not necessarily creating a huge carbon impact, if that makes sense. We're creating a differential between Holstein steers and dairy beef animals.
So, Dr. Howard, what are the positives associated with bringing that beef on dairy product through the system? What are some of the challenges that maybe are glossed over sometimes in popular press?
Okay. Yeah, very good question. And I think the biggest thing that I'll like to initiate this conversation with is that crossing a dairy animal with a beef animal is not a silver bullet in any way, shape, or form to miraculously change them to this perfect creature as it relates to the beef industry. The one thing it does do for all of us is it turns them black, and they're solid, and they instantly have a $5 a head premium. So, that as it relates to marketing of Angus beef through the supply chain is certainly an overnight success. As we start thinking about some of the other things as it relates to the supply chain, though, it gets a little more challenging. The beef on dairy thing in no way addresses the liver abscess issue. And until liver abscesses are addressed, any of those animals that are managed through that calf ranch on feed for that many days are going to be discounted by packers, provided they know what they are. Simply put, it's not an issue of the liver, it's the loss of the skirt, and if we start losing outside skirts, we're talking $30, $40 a head. Once that starts happening, a packer's not going to roll the dice and gamble, they're going to just discount the cattle across the board. Maybe on a more complex level than that also, I think we also need to understand what we're actually doing. I mean, we've got this great vision that we're taking an animal that's heavier muscled and crossing it with one that's lighter muscled and somehow creating this higher cutability, higher, more efficient creature. And it sometimes works that way, and there are certainly producers out there who have developed these cattle and found some very positive matings that work that way. But I would also say that there are some things about a calf-fed Holstein steer as a purebred that are actually pretty darn good. They're lean, they're high quality, and when cut particular ways, there's a lot of ways that a packer can make money on those animals. They also pay less for them, so that's a pretty darn good way to make money too. When we cross them with a beef animal, we're adding some fat, we're changing some composition, and the reality can be that if we push them too far in terms of that subcutaneous fat element, we might actually end up with the worst of both worlds. We end up with an animal that's not quite as heavy muscled as a native beef animal, and it's going to be a lot fatter than a Holstein. And there's some individuals in this room who have proven time and time again that subcutaneous fat is going to be the most significant driver of cutability in that beef carcass, potentially followed by or after seam fat. Fat is going to be king. So as much as we like to talk about, breeding for muscle and composition and some of those types of things that certain livestock judging coaches will teach us from time to time, it really boils down to the white component of that carcass is really as critical as anything. When we talk about the feed yard element, I know you hit on that as well, and I'm not going to pretend to be a feed yard expert by any stretch of the imagination, but do we see some maybe changes in terms of efficiency? Yeah, absolutely. But the one thing about a purebred Holstein steer is we do know what to expect, right? And when managed the right way, there are, again, a lot of great ways to make money on a purebred Holstein steer. So I think we need to be very careful, again, with the idea that we have this silver bullet in adding beef genetics to dairy animals and miraculously making them overnight this exponentially more valuable animal.
So Steve, Dr. Howard touches on some of the liver concerns from a carcass standpoint. They certainly have some issues from depression of gain and the like in the feed yard, maybe some morbidity situations in a feed yard on occasion. How do we muster the courage to tackle things that are that sensitive, right? Really high value cattle, people that have worked hard to build these cattle right to meet their demands, yet those are the ones that are frankly challenging the sustainability model quite hard. There are a lot of resources and inputs that went into that 1,350 pound steer that woke up dead that day, right? And now we're done.
And I don't think we have to muster up to do that. For the most part, the consumers are very, very little aware of the entire feeding process and the feedlots. Those that are detractors, they are. And so we're doing a good job. The fact that we have an open discussion about that here in these meetings and in other meetings that we've been to and within the Colorado Cattlemen's Association and Colorado Livestock Association, we have those conversations. And the fact that we as the producers and the feeders are willing to engage in that and try to find answers for it, engaging university and research help to try to find an answer. That's your best pathway forward. You never have to be afraid of answering a question if you're in the process of trying to find a solution to the problem. But if you're trying to sweep it under the carpet, yeah, you're going to get yourself in trouble if you try to avoid it. And we're not trying to avoid it. I think we're taking it on. We're taking on high altitude problems, and we're taking on problems in late stage feeding issues and addressing it correctly. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and you've got to engage and get after it and go through those tough learning phases where you try something that didn't work, so we try something else that didn't work, and you finally come to a solution. And I'm not disappointed that we're having that conversation, that we're working at it. As an individual that has fed some cattle, we don't like it when that happens. And worse yet, the guys in the feed yard don't like it. They are as disappointed as we are, because they take great pride in the work that they do, trying to get your product to the scale and down the road. And when it doesn't happen, they're disappointed. Those are all good signs that we're in the right place within the industry when we're trying to do it from an animal welfare and from an integrity side in openness.
Amen is my comment to that. Thank you. I'm going to switch gears on you real quick because I have one more line of thinking I'd like to pull on. I really enjoyed a brief visit with Dr. John a little bit earlier today when we were talking about the very pragmatic decisions when somebody's sitting in a corporate office and they are making decisions on the protein that they're going to put into that retail space. And whether we like it or not, there is a board and there's an infrastructure in that business that says our carbon impact of that protein can be X. You need to get to X. sometimes it can be a little ouchy for us when they're making that decision. Dr. Crowley, do you mind kind of pulling on that just a second?
Yeah, and these are just observations from different interactions we've had over the last few years as we do business. So there's metrics out there for a carbon footprint for a product. And one of the first, I've seen it for a while, but one of the things I put up in New Mexico at BIF last year was a screen capture of a tweet from an Irish politician, and he was in a restaurant in Dublin. And the restaurant goes across the UK and Ireland. And he was inside there, and on the menu it had carbon footprints of the dishes, right? So you had a chicken burger, a veggie burger, you had probably 3 or 4 beef burgers. And you're for a point of the story, the magnitude of those were kind of around, 20 kilos of carbon for the beef burger dishes, and you're talking about like 5 for the chicken, and I think it was less than 1 kilo of carbon on the plate of a veggie dish, which we could have a whole other argument about the numbers. But what I'm trying to get to is those numbers were on a menu where consumers were about to make decisions. Do we want a chicken burger or a beef burger today? Do you know? And that was going to influence their decisions. I don't know what corporate were doing with this angle, whether it's whether they had some sustainability protocol or promise that they needed to chase. They needed to be able to say, look at us, we've got a green tick next to our name. You have these, most corporations now need to be environmentally, sustainably responsible. So you have procurement people going, I can only have X kilos of carbon on my shelf at any one time to meet our corporate promise. So that means maybe dialing down the amount of beef and dialing up the amount of pork or chicken. Like, these things are happening. Within a beef packer, I've seen, to get to our carbon number of kill this month, they've asked us to do an exercise of give us a whole range of types of animals in a beef system and give us the carbon footprint of them all. Now, you're differing by kilos of carbon per hanging carcass weight, but nevertheless, when they multiply it up over a kill a month per year, it influences their, and back to the dairy beef piece, that's the carbon footprint of a dairy beef carcass versus a beef carcass. Well, to meet my promise, I'm going to source a bit more dairy beef this month. So they're the types of things we're seeing, and you can argue about the numbers and where the numbers are come from and how they're calculated. I think there's a whole other echelon of people that are having that conversation. I bet you everybody on this panel is involved in those at some level. But I think that's the conversation you were alluding to earlier on, and there's some of the stories that I've seen and the things that I've been involved with.
And so what I want to point out to the folks in the room is some of that doesn't feel very good, Bert, right? But first of all, notice he repeated a couple times, he wasn't speaking to the veracity of the metrics. He wasn't saying, are they credible metrics or not? He's being candid and honest. This is what's happening. And so we need to know this. Not knowing this, to Steve's point, putting it under the rug does us no good. So I appreciate you sharing that story. So I'm going to take that one step further. Dr. Howard, I'm guessing as you're working, some of those merchandisers that are working with you probably on occasion broach some of those topics?
100%. And, I think it's also, the reality is becoming more and more as we reference those groups that are out there procuring meat for some of these companies, in particular the companies that we're marketing to who appeal to newer, younger generations of people. We're seeing people step into those procurement roles who are even further removed from not just agriculture, but even maybe from the meat industry as a whole. So we're talking to people who maybe have been great at procuring produce for a number of years or are tremendous just in terms of business management, but they're brand new to the world of meat. There's also a ton of information available to those folks. And not very long ago, we were on the phone with our ranch manager. Meyer also owns a ranch in Montana, and we're talking to one of our very, very prominent customers in food service, and again, a group of extremely intelligent 20 and 30 somethings who didn't have a whole lot of background in agriculture or meat. this ranch manager is going through all the things that they're doing, no different in terms of rotational grazing, managing forage, managing waterways, a lot of the good things that we talked about here today. And he finishes a bit of it, and the question came back, well, how frequently are you rotating those cows off those pastures? And the ranch managers kind of said, well, we manage to a certain amount of forage and then we move them. And they kind of paused for a second and asked, well, you aren't moving them every day? And you could tell that the further they had gotten into it, there's so much information out there in certain areas that, you know, they had dialed into this idea of mob grazing and rotating every day, moving a hot wire every day, and trying to explain to them why that might not work in certain parts of the world, why different areas of the cattle production cycle are different, and there's no one size fits all is tough. To your question, absolutely, we're having those conversations, and the real challenge is becoming with the information that's available and the fact that for the geographic diversity of this country, there is no one size fits all answer. Trying to provide a check of the box or a 160 character headline, whatever you want to call it, is really tough. So they're happening, and it's a challenging spot to be in.
Dr. Place, I guess I'm going to ask you to essentially pretend as if you work for Forbes.com for a second. Is there any chance that you think maybe some of the various economic realities at present are allowing us to potentially recenter this conversation in a slightly more healthy spot to where all parties can communicate in a way where we don't all have our guard up and talk in coded words?
Yeah, so, well, that's hopefully, right? Always be optimistic that we can get to those conversations. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, this economic environment brings home some of those things of what's important and what's a nice to have, right? And I think ultimately with a lot of these sustainability initiatives, one thing is for many companies, it's not also going to go away, right? I think that's an important thing to note. But there's always been a challenge in this space, and having been on that corporate side too, of oftentimes the sustainability initiatives are separate from the business, separate from core business, and we see that sometimes in the meat business as well, right? Who sits in the sustainability desk maybe doesn't talk to the protein side of the business very often, and so that can be a challenge, right? So I think where we'll see change is where those sustainability initiatives truly become integrated into the business case and become a little bit more realistic. And I think Dr. Crowley's comment of pricing carbon in is really ultimately where if people are serious about reducing emissions, there has to be a price put on it, and you have to price it into the system. However that gets done, that's ultimately how it has to happen. And I think that's just on the academic side, when we make pitches for funding and things like that, that's usually where people put the brakes on. It's like, wow, this actually costs money to do this type of research. I'm not so interested in this anymore, right? So I think those economic realities hopefully will become more apparent, and we'll get to a little bit more maturity in those discussions. But I think that's always the caution, is you can make really grand claims, but if you can't back them up, there will be somebody that will come after you as a greenwashing claim, which is, again, like whitewashing, but saying you're making an environmental or sustainability claim that you can't back up. That pressure will just probably become more acute as all these fairly arbitrary dates of 2030, 2040, different dates that certain companies have put out there come to fruition.
So kind of my last little piece here would be, we've heard Dr. Crowley talk a couple times about life cycle assessments. We heard you just talk about making or assembling real economic components to some sort of carbon or emission standard. I know Dr. Howard's been in spaces where some geneticists like Dr. Matt Spangler or Troy Rowan have highlighted some comments that we would make. From a Simmental standpoint, one of the metrics, again, to your point, a believable metric, one of the metrics that's quite important to this population is a whole life cycle metric. We refer to ours as the all-purpose index, but there are other partners who do very good work at generating whole life cycle indexes of some sort. one of the key to the whole life cycle index is you take into all the things of serious economic impact to these folks and their business and their customers, the cow longevity you mentioned earlier, the yield components that were mentioned here. But if that index is going to have value as a true sustainability metric as well, it does have to have the nimbleness ultimately, if you can put economics to carbon, to conceivably incorporate that. And so I know Callie was pointing at me and said she had a question. And so in interest of time, we best let her do that.
First, thank you to the panel for being here today. I think it's great. My question, I guess, is more to Dr. Place. When you're talking about being more efficient from a greenhouse standpoint and dry matter intake, do you see a correlation between, I'll say, a cow on forage represented, is that the same efficiency as you would see in a concentrate place, or is there differences too? Because, I mean, from a whole herd standpoint, that is something that we take account into. And so I just want to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we're trying to figure out now. So we have certain animals that we're measuring for the second or third time, ones that we've measured on grass and on high forage diets, right? It would make all of our lives easier if the correlation was really strong. I think it's probably not that strong, unfortunately. Animals probably re-rank themselves pretty good. And one of the things that we've kind of noticed is just basically the correlation between dry matter intake and methane seems to be stronger in a high forage diet than in a high concentrate diet, right? Meaning, you know, kind of my thought there is like maybe more of those inherent differences in the rumen microbiome show themselves more when you have a high concentrate diet where you've already knocked down methane substantially. Now the inherent variability animal to animal surfaces a little bit more, if that makes sense. So that's one of those things that as we collect more data, we'll hopefully be able to answer that question.
If we eliminated every cow on the face of the earth, and instead we had buffalo and deer and antelope and prairie dogs and pack rats and etc., consuming that fiber instead, what would be the difference in the amount of methane produced globally? And what would that do to the supply of protein available to the human race?
This sounds almost certainly like a Dr. Place question.
He was looking at her the whole time.
Congratulations.
Yeah. No, those are great questions. And yeah, so it's an intuitive question because ultimately it's always tricky to call cattle a human-caused emission source because, of course, they're ruminant and there's ruminants running around out wild, right? So it's not like we call those a source as well. So it's not a global analysis, but there was analysis done now back in like 2017 that was published in the Proceedings of National Academies of Sciences that kind of answered that question for the U.S. And not just cattle, but said, what if we eliminated all livestock, every chicken, pig, cattle, every species that's domestic farm animals in the U.S., and what if all humans and all pets remaining had to be vegans, right? We all had to eat a plant-based diet. And so these numbers that have been thrown out there, if you look at just the direct emissions that come from animals in our system, it's roughly 4% total. And they found that if you eliminated all those animals, you'd only reduce emissions 2.6% because you get rid of some of the benefits of livestock, right? Now you have to, instead of having that recycling of plant material and the animal manure back to the plants, you have to use more synthetic fertilizer. We'd all have to be eating a lot more beans, right, for our protein requirements and for the nitrogen credits in the soil and other legumes. And that's a key thing. In that analysis, they assumed that all the livestock disappear with a snap, which of course is unrealistic anyways, right? We have one final barbecue and that's it, right, basically. But there's some key trade-offs there. One is like, if you get rid of all those animals, yes, what is the animal, the ungulate that fits that niche, right, on those grazing lands that Steve and all the other ranchers in the U.S. and North America are managing, right? There's going to have to be a ruminant in many of those systems to maintain those grassland ecosystems. And so that methane would be eating into that 2.6% even more, right? It wouldn't even be that high. And I think the key thing from that study was just the diet or the food supply in the U.S. wouldn't have enough essential micronutrients to nourish everybody, right? Things like vitamin B12 only come from animal source foods, right? And it's absolutely essential for cognitive development, for everything that we need as humans. So you would get in a situation where you'd have actually more pounds of food, more calories. America does not need more calories, right? But you wouldn't have a nutrient-dense food supply. And so that experiment kind of gets, that thought experiment basically kind of gets at your question, and that just highlights that, you know, as the comment was made, we're trying to shave little edges off, right? We're not going to eliminate enteric methane from animals, and I would argue some of these policies in certain parts of the world of trying to shrink herds are also wrong-headed, because you got to think about it at a global scale. Just because you cut your dairy herd in the Netherlands or New Zealand or Ireland, you're not lowering global demand, right? So it's going to come from somewhere else, and that's what we classically call like carbon leakage. You're just going to shift production to a higher impact country. What did you actually do to help planet Earth? Nothing, right? So sometimes it's really important to zoom out to that bigger picture, and that's, your question is intuitive there, of the answer is not get rid of animals, right? It's just, can we shave some of the inefficiency off our system even more? But at the end of the day, cattle are not driving, they're not the main driver of climate change, period, right? That's very clear.
I'm from Canada. Canadian Simmental, like IGS, we're a member of our Canadian Roundtable. I was down here in Denver in November at the global meeting, and going back to what Bob Hogue had said earlier about New Zealand and planting trees and everything, and I think at times we need to make sure that the people that are in these organizations, like Steve, have some stuff on their boots. They know the answers, and they do it in a professional manner. And the world's run by the people that show up. We all know that. But they better speak up and speak up intelligently. And I feel heartened by what I'm hearing here.
Reaching influencers is a critical element of what Sarah's trying to do, what we're trying to do. And earlier we talked about the beef checkoff and what the beef checkoff can do. Several times a year, the beef checkoff brings in nutrition influencers, top-notch chefs, top-notch influencers that are talking to school districts, hospitals, doctors. It's unbelievable how much misinformation is in the medical field, and our dollars that we contribute as producers are allowing the beef checkoff to bring, we had 20-some last year in Denver, and got to talk to them about these factors of nutrition deserts, the quality of beef, the necessity of beef, and how it's raised. They saw a ranch, they saw a farm, they saw a feedlot, and they saw a packing process. And to a T, not a one of them was going to go back and go, we aren't eating this. But when the message is given to those that aren't in agriculture, when the message comes to them with all the explanation and in a way that they can digest, they become supporters. And so that's what we're trying to do, is reach those that touch other people's lives.
So my last question, and I'll leave it out, anybody can touch on it if they want or if they wish not to. These folks are germplasm producers for the most part. Their job is to utilize genetic prowess to go make somebody else's family more likely to stay on that piece of dirt than they would have been otherwise. To the folks on the panel, are there any tangible steps that you might suggest for them as they are making some of those genetic decisions that make them more effective at that craft as you look out over the next 5 to 10 years? Are there particular things they should be selecting for from a genetic standpoint, or maybe selecting against?
Female fertility and growth rate in some of the stuff we've done comes out as the biggest relative emphasis. And they're also tied in with economic efficiency as well. So kind of if you build a good cow herd that has low maintenance, along with, and it was one of the very first questions you asked me, it's that, how do you have that low maintenance animal? It ties in very well with economic efficiency as well. So they're kind of going to be the animals, if ever the tide comes in real quick and said, right, we need to shift the type of cow we have, type of national herd we have, I think they're the type of seed stock that will float to the top of lists or desires.
So could I just make sure I understand correctly? So in terminology parlance, what we might understand, essentially, let's select for some stability, right? Select for some cow longevity, hence fertility and other things underneath. Is that a little bit what I heard?
Yep, yeah, your longevity stability is going to lessen the amount of replacement heifers you need. Your increase in growth rates are going to get those out the door faster and dilute your maintenance of your terminal animal. They'll do a lot of what you need to do. Yep.
Very good. Thank you. Anybody else want to touch that, or do you feel like?
That is the big one. And then maybe on the longer term horizon, as we get to the point of like, if we can develop it, right, those different enteric traits, that would be in the longer term, right? But building that into those indexes where basically it's just another way to incrementally improve efficiency, lose less energy, feed energy as methane.
I think on the back end of it, just continuing to understand the amount of resources that we are still dedicating through the packing segment of all of this. And I hit on it earlier, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, moderate, efficient cow and those types of things, but we can't be afraid to make that terminal mating, because we are still going to need to deliver that heavier carcass, that marbles. And I think the other thing that I would emphasize once again is finding that bull that does so at a lower level of external fat. And I know that's, you know, something that we kind of chase as a unicorn scenario, and Dr. Place kind of hit on it with finding that logical slaughter endpoint, but really dialing that in and delivering an animal that has some cutability in addition to quality. We've done a tremendous job of selecting for quality in the industry over the past several decades, and now I think we just really need to turn that notch and dial in that cutability element and really focus on the white meat, or white tissue, if we will. So,
I will say, what a pleasure to have this sort of conversation that I'm guessing when some of you saw it on the agenda, you're like, okay, here we go. Yet, notice, you heard competence, no hyperbole, no antagonistic approach, just humble, high-character folks trying to offer their little piece of solution to a pretty complicated puzzle. Kind of refreshing, isn't it? Would you do me a favor? Show these folks how much we appreciate their efforts.